The laughter rolled through the hall like a rising tide. 300 guests, draped in designer gowns and tailored suits, champagne glasses in hand, stared at the woman standing alone on the platform no one wanted to bid on. "Someone take one for the team," a man shouted from the bar. She clasped her hands at her waist and stood her ground, chin lifted, eyes burning, refusing to break. Then the room fell silent, because the most dangerous man in the room had just stood up. Nikolai Volkov hadn't spoken all night. He hadn't bid on anyone. He hadn't smiled once. But now he was walking toward her, and every breath in the room seemed to vanish. He looked at her, only her, and spoke 5 words that changed everything. "I'm interested. I'll take her." $100,000. For the woman no one wanted, and no one in that room understood why. But she did. And in the end, she would understand everything, and it would destroy her. 300 guests stood beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Bellworth estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, their laughter rising like smoke through the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. Outside, November rain lashed the windows. Inside, champagne flutes clinked with the hollow precision of people who had never been hungry, never been cold, never been told no. And in the center of that immaculate room, beneath lights designed to make diamonds sparkle and skin glow, a woman stood alone on a raised platform, and no one was bidding. Her name was Vivienne Calloway. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair that she had spent 2 hours curling that afternoon, a borrowed navy dress that pulled slightly at the zipper, and hands that were shaking so badly she had clasped them together at her waist to keep anyone from noticing. She was a registered nurse at Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan. She worked night shifts in the trauma ward. She had held dying men's hands at 3 in the morning and never flinched. But standing here, on this platform, in front of 300 people who were looking at her like she was a math problem no one wanted to solve, she felt something worse than fear. She felt invisible. The charity auction had been her sister's idea. Not a real auction, of course. A companionship gala. One of those absurd fundraisers where eligible women volunteered to be bid on for a dinner date, with all proceeds going to the Bellworth Children's Foundation. Her sister Margot had done it the year before and raised $11,000 in under 90 seconds. Margot was a size 4 with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes and a jawline that could cut paper. Vivienne was not Margot. Vivienne had always known she was not Margot. But knowing it and feeling it were different things. And right now, standing on this platform, while the auctioneer smiled with increasing desperation, she was feeling it in every cell of her body. "We'll start at $500, the auctioneer said, his voice too bright. $500 for a lovely dinner with this wonderful young woman. 500. Silence. Not the polite silence of consideration, the thick, wet silence of a room that had collectively decided to look at its shoes. Someone near the bar coughed. A woman in emerald earrings leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her hand, and the husband snorted. It was the kind of sound people make when they think they are being quiet, but they are not. They are never quiet. They want to be heard. That is the entire point. "She's a nurse," the auctioneer continued, scanning his card. "She enjoys hiking, Italian cooking, and, she volunteers at the 300. The voice came from a table near the back. A heavy-set man in a too-tight tuxedo raised his glass with a grin that had nothing to do with generosity. His name was Preston Hale, and Vivienne did not know him, but she would remember his face for the rest of her life. 300, the auctioneer said, brightening. "We have 300. Do I hear?" "I'll do 300, Preston Hale repeated, louder now, playing to the room, "but only if she promises to split the dessert." The laughter hit like a wave. Not everyone laughed, maybe not even most, but enough that the sound filled the room and bounced off the walls and wrapped around Vivienne's chest like a fist. She felt the heat climb from her collarbone to her ears. Her vision blurred. She could feel the platform beneath her heels, could feel the exact moment her body became a punchline. and she understood with perfect clarity that she had made a terrible mistake coming here. The auctioneer tried to recover. 300, we have 300. Let's keep this moving. Oh, come on, another voice called, male, drunk, amused. Give the girl a break. Someone take one for the team. More laughter. Vivian's sister, somewhere in the crowd, was pushing through bodies with a face like a storm. But she was too far away, and it was too late. And the damage was already a living thing in the room, breathing and growing, and feeding on the silence between the jokes. Vivian's jaw tightened. She would not cry. She had made that decision on the platform in the first 5 seconds, the way she made decisions in the trauma ward when a patient was coding, and there was no time for fear. She would not cry, she would not run, and she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. She stood perfectly still, chin level, eyes fixed on a point above the crowd, where a painting of a fox hunt hung in a gilded frame. She breathed, and then the room changed. It did not change all at once. It changed the way a lake changes when a stone drops into its center, the ripples moving outward in slow, concentric circles. The laughter dimmed. Conversations halted mid-syllable. Heads turned. All of them turned in the same direction, toward the far-off corner of the ballroom where the shadows were deepest and the light did not quite reach. A man was standing. He had been sitting at a table that most of the room had been pretending not to notice all evening. The table had 4 chairs. 3 were occupied by men in dark suits who looked like they had been carved from the same block of granite. The 4th chair was his, and it was now empty because he was on his feet, and when he was on his feet, you paid attention. You did not have a choice. His name was Nikolai Volkov. He was 43 years old. He stood 6'2". He had dark hair cut short, a face composed of sharp angles and deliberate calm, and eyes the color of frozen steel that gave away absolutely nothing. He wore a black suit that fit him the way a second skin fits a predator, and he moved through the room the way a blade moves through silk, without resistance, without sound. He was the head of an organization that most people in this room knew about, and none of them discussed. For them, he controlled shipping routes along the Eastern Seaboard, owned legitimate businesses in 12 states, and had a reputation that functioned like gravity, invisible, constant, and inescapable. 3 sitting governors had his phone number. 2 federal judges owed him favors they would take to their graves. He had been invited to this gala not because anyone wanted him here, but because no one had the courage to leave him off the list. He had not spoken all evening. He had not bid on anyone. He had watched the proceedings with the flat, disinterested gaze of a man observing traffic from a high window. He had not laughed at any of the jokes. He had not smiled. He had done nothing to suggest he was even aware that other people existed until this exact moment when he set his napkin on the table, adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, and began walking toward the platform. The room held its breath. The auctioneer's smile froze on his face like a crack in plaster. Mr. Volkov, Nikolai stopped 5 feet from the platform. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked at Vivian. He looked at her with no expression whatsoever, the way a man looks at a locked door he has already decided to open. His gaze moved across her face, her hands, the borrowed dress, the proud set of her jaw, and then it returned to her eyes and stayed there. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that has weight. "She'll do," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the faintest trace of an accent that most people could not place. "I'll take her." He did not say how much. He did not ask the price. He reached into his jacket, produced a black card, and held it between 2 fingers toward the auctioneer, the way one might hand a parking ticket to a valet. The gesture said everything. The number did not matter. The auctioneer blinked. Sir, the current bid is 300. Run it for 100,000. The words landed on the room like a slap. A woman near the front dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor, and no one looked at it because everyone was looking at Nikolai Volkov, who was still looking at Vivian Calloway, who was looking back at him with an expression that she could not have named if her life depended on it. $100,000 for a dinner date with the woman no one had wanted. Preston Hale, the man who had made the dessert joke, set down his drink so quickly it sloshed over the rim. His face had gone the color of old milk. Across the room, Margot Calloway pressed both hands over her mouth. The auctioneer fumbled the black card, nearly dropped it, and cleared his throat 3 times before he managed to speak. "Sis sold," he said. "Sold to Mr. Volkov for $100,000. Nikolai extended his hand toward Vivian. Not up, the way a man offers help. Out, the way a man offers a choice. "Come," he said. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was something in between. Something that Vivian would spend the next several weeks trying to categorize and failing, because Nikolai Volkov did not fit into categories. He existed outside of them, in a space where the rules were his and always had been. She did not take his hand. She stepped down from the platform under her own power, her heels clicking on the marble, her back straight, her chin still level. She walked past him, paused, and looked over her shoulder. "I assume you'll tell me where to be," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. It surprised him too, though no one would have known it from looking at him. The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. The ghost of one. "Tomorrow," he said. 7 o'clock. A car will come." He turned and walked out of the ballroom without another word, his 3 granite men falling into step behind him like shadows. The door closed, the room exhaled, and Vivian Calloway stood in the center of 300 people who were now looking at her very differently, and she thought, "What have I just walked into?" She did not sleep that night. She went home to her 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, the one with the radiator that clanked like a drunk percussionist, and the kitchen window that overlooked a parking lot, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and tried to understand what had happened. She replayed it. The silence, the laughter, the dessert joke, the sound of his shoes on the marble, his eyes, the way he had said her, not her name, he had not used her name, the way he had said "she'll do," as if he had been looking for something specific, and she had met the criteria of a test she had not known she was taking. She looked him up. Her phone glowed in the dark as she scrolled through articles, most of which said very little because the people who wrote about Nikolai Volkov tended to be careful. Businessman, investor, philanthropist, according to some. Connected to organized crime, according to others. Though no charges had ever been filed, no indictments had ever stuck, and the one journalist who had published a deep investigation in 2019 had retracted it 6 weeks later and moved to Portugal. There were photographs, galas, ribbon cuttings, a hospital wing dedication in Brooklyn. In every photograph his expression was the same, controlled, remote, unreadable. He looked like a man who had decided what his face would show the world and had never deviated from that decision. She should cancel. She knew she should cancel. Every rational cell in her body was screaming at her to call the foundation, return the money, and pretend the evening had never happened. But there was another part of her, the part that had stood on that platform and refused to cry, the part that had worked 12-hour shifts and held dying strangers and chosen a life of service over a life of comfort. And that part was asking a different question. Not why did he choose me, but what did he see? The car arrived at 6:55. The following evening, it was a black Mercedes S-Class with tinted windows and a driver who opened the rear door without speaking. Vivian had changed 3 times. She had settled on a dark green wrap dress that she owned, not borrowed, and low heels that she could walk in. She had done her own makeup. She had told no one except Margot, who had texted 17 times in the last hour, each text more urgent than the last. The final one read, "If you don't text me by 10, I'm calling the police." The car drove into Manhattan, south through the park, and pulled up outside a restaurant on a quiet side street in the West Village that Vivian had never noticed before. There was no sign, no name, just a black door and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The driver opened her door, gestured toward the entrance, and returned to the car without a word. Although inside, the restaurant was small, no more than 12 tables, and all of them were empty, except one. Nikolai Volkov sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, a glass of water in front of him, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to the forearms. Without the jacket, in the warm amber light of the restaurant, he looked different, not softer, different, like a weapon placed carefully on a table instead of held in a hand. He stood when she entered. That surprised her. "Vivian," he said. He had learned her name. Of course he had. "Mr. Volkov." "Nikolai," she sat. He sat. A waiter appeared, poured wine that she had not ordered, and vanished. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Vivian studied him across the small table, and he let her, the way a man who is used to being studied lets it happen, without fidgeting, without filling the silence with noise. She noticed things. The thin scar that ran along his left jawline, disappearing beneath his ear, the way his hands rested on the table, still, relaxed, the hands of a man who had trained himself out of nervous movement, the fact that he had seated himself with a clear sightline to both the door and the kitchen. "You're wondering why," he said. "Everyone in that room is wondering why." "I am not interested in everyone in that room." She took a sip of the wine. It was extraordinary. She didn't know enough about wine to explain why, but she knew it the way she knew a patient's vitals were wrong before the monitors caught up, the way she knew something was off in the half-second before a code was called. The wine was extraordinary, and this man was dangerous, and she was here. "So tell me," she said. "Why?" He turned his water glass a quarter inch. "Because you were the only person on that stage tonight who did not perform." "I'm sorry." "Every other woman, they smiled, they waved, they played a part. You stood there and did nothing. You refused to be anything other than what you are. That is rare. That's a $100,000 observation. I have paid more for less." The dinner lasted 2.5 hours. He asked her questions, not the usual ones. Not where do you grow up, or what do you do for fun. He asked her what time she usually woke for her shifts. He asked her what the trauma ward smelled like. He asked her if she had ever lost a patient she thought she could save, and when she said yes, 3, he nodded once and said nothing else about it, as if the number itself was a sufficient conversation. He asked her what she ate when she got home at 5 in the morning and had to be back by 6 in the evening, and she said cereal, usually, or whatever was left in the fridge, and he looked at her with something that might have been disapproval, or might have been something else entirely. She asked him almost nothing, not because she was not curious, but because she understood instinctively that Nikolai Volkov was not a man who answered questions. He was a man who decided what you would know about him and when you would know it, and no amount of asking would accelerate that timeline. At the end of the evening, the driver took her home. Nikolai walked her to the car. He opened the door himself, not the driver. "Thank you," she said. "For the dinner, for the—" She paused. "For the $100,000, I suppose. The money went to the foundation." "I know, but it was still... It was nothing." He said it the way someone might say the sky is blue, not as a boast, as a fact. She got into the car. He closed the door. Through the tinted window she watched him stand on the sidewalk in the cold, watching the car pull away. And she thought, that is a man who is used to watching things leave. She expected that to be the end of it. She had fulfilled the obligation. One dinner. Done. She would return to her shifts, her radiator, her cereal at 5 in the morning, and the evening would become a story she told at parties, if she ever went to parties, which she generally did not. But 3 days later, a package arrived at her apartment. It was a brown box, unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a set of professional-grade meal prep containers, a printed card from a high-end meal delivery service, and a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored paper. The handwriting was precise and angular, like architectural drafting. Your shifts are long. You should eat properly. Deliveries begin Monday. N. She stared at the note for a full minute. Then she called Margot. He's sending me food. He's sending you food. Margot, a mafia boss, is sending me food. Alleged mafia boss. And honestly, Viv, this is the most romantic thing that has ever happened in our family. This isn't romantic. This is, I don't know what this is. But the meals arrived on Monday and Tuesday and every day after that. They were not extravagant. Grilled chicken with roasted vegetables, salmon with rice and a lemon dill sauce, a hearty minestrone that arrived still warm on a Thursday night when the temperature dropped to 19 degrees. They were the meals of someone who had researched what a night shift nurse needed to sustain a 12-hour shift and had acted on that research with the precision of a military operation. She texted the number on the delivery card. "Thank you," she wrote. "You don't have to do this." The reply came 4 hours later. "I know." A week passed, then another. She did not see him. She did not hear from him, except through the meals, which arrived with clockwork regularity, each one slightly different, each one exactly what she needed on that particular day, as if someone was paying attention to the weather, to her schedule, to some invisible algorithm of care that she could not decode. Then, one night, at 2 in the morning, she walked out of Lenox Hill after a brutal shift. A 14-year-old boy had come in with 3 gunshot wounds. She had held pressure on his abdomen for 11 minutes while the surgical team prepped. He survived. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who was very tired and wanted to go home and did not want to wait for the subway. The black Mercedes was parked at the curb. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and said nothing. The car was warm. There was a bottle of water in the cup holder and a soft blanket folded on the seat. She got in because she was too exhausted to argue, and because in that moment, the car felt like the only kind thing in the entire city. She fell asleep before they reached the bridge. When she woke, she was parked outside her building in Astoria. The driver was gone. The blanket was still around her shoulders. On the seat beside her was another note. "You stayed with the boy. I know. Get some rest." And Deshure sat in the dark car and pressed the note to her chest and felt something shift inside her, some tectonic plate of resistance grinding slowly against something softer, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, because feeling things was dangerous when you were a woman who had spent her entire life being told that the space she occupied in the world was too much. She called him the next day. He picked up on the second ring. "How did you know about the boy?" A pause. "I know things." "That's not an answer. It is the only answer I have for you right now." "Nikolai." She caught herself on his name, felt the weight of it. "What is this? What are we doing?" Another pause, longer. She could hear something in the background, a low murmur of voices, the clink of glass. He was somewhere. He was always somewhere. "I would like to see you again," he said. "If you are willing." "Why?" "Because you are the only person who has asked me that question and meant it." She agreed to see him again. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself it was research, the way she might research a rare disease with clinical detachment and professional interest. She was lying, and she knew it, but she was a woman who had spent 31 years building walls, and walls do not come down because someone sends you minestrone. They met the following Saturday at a different restaurant, this one in Brooklyn, equally invisible, equally empty. She wore her own clothes. He wore his usual armor of dark fabric and controlled silence. But something was different. He was not relaxed. Nikolai Volkov did not relax, but he was present in a way he had not been at the first dinner. He looked at her when she spoke. Not past her, not through her, but at her with an attention so complete, it felt almost physical, as if his gaze had weight and temperature. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. He would call, always at the same time, always brief, always to arrange the next meeting. Sometimes dinner, sometimes a walk. Along the river in Red Hook, where the cargo ships sat like sleeping giants, and the wind smelled of salt and diesel. Once, a private screening of a film, Othini, she had mentioned wanting to see, in a theater that was empty except for the two of them and the projectionist, who left after pressing play. He did not touch her. He did not try. He maintained a distance so precise it seemed calibrated, as if he had drawn a circle around her and forbidden himself from crossing it. It confused her, this distance. It also, if she was honest, devastated her, because she was a woman who had spent her life being the one people did not reach for. And here was a man who seemed to want her, near him but not close, present but not held, and she could not tell if it was restraint or repulsion. She began to enter his world in increments. She met Alexei, his second in command, a massive Belarusian with a beard like a biblical prophet and a laugh that could shake plaster from walls. She met Konstantin, the driver, who turned out to have a 9-year-old daughter named Polini, who drew pictures of cats on everything, including, on one memorable occasion, the interior of the Mercedes. She met the staff at Nikolai's residence in Brooklyn Heights, a converted warehouse with 20-foot ceilings, an exposed brick, and almost no personal belongings, as if the man who lived there had decided long ago that attachment was a form of weakness. She noticed things, the way his men deferred to him, not with fear alone but with a respect that bordered on devotion. The way he spoke to Konstantin's daughter when she appeared at the warehouse one afternoon, crouching down to her height, his voice losing every edge it carried in the wider world, becoming something almost gentle. The scars on his hands, which she catalogued with a nurse's eye, defensive wounds on the knuckles, a burn on the left palm, a thin white line across the web of his right thumb that suggested a blade. She noticed, too, the things he did for her that he never mentioned. The parking lot outside her apartment window was repaved one Tuesday. Her radiator stopped clanking on a Wednesday. When she mentioned in passing that she worried about walking to the subway at 4 in the morning, she noticed the following week that the street light at the end of her block, which had been out for months, was suddenly working again. She could never prove any of it. That was the point. But there were things she could not access, doors in the warehouse that were always closed, phone calls he stepped away to take, the way his expression would sometimes go completely blank in the middle of a conversation, as if a switch had been flipped and the man sitting across from her had been replaced by a machine wearing his face, the way he never, not once in all their conversations, mentioned his past. She knew his present. She knew his routine, his preferences, the way he took his coffee, black, no sugar, in a ceramic cup, never paper. But his history was a locked room, and she did not have the key. One evening, 4 weeks into whatever they were, she pushed. They were sitting in his warehouse, in the vast, open living space that felt more like a gallery than a home. Rain was coming down in sheets outside the tall, industrial windows, and the city was reduced to smears of light in the wet glass. She had brought leftover pasta from a batch she had made that afternoon, and he had eaten it without comment. But she had seen the way he looked at the container, at her hands, at the simple domesticity of the gesture, with something that was not hunger, but was adjacent to it. "I need you to tell me something real," she said. He set down his fork. "I have not lied to you. You haven't told me the truth either. You've told me facts, where you eat, what you drink, what time you wake up, but you haven't told me anything, not the real thing, not the reason. The reason for what? For me? For any of this?" She gestured around the vast empty space. "You are Nikolai Volkov. You could have anyone. You could have the woman who raised $10,000 with a wink, or the socialite with the emerald earrings, or literally any person in that room who would have said yes before you finished the sentence. And you chose me, and you have been—" She stopped. The word she wanted to use was kind, but it felt insufficient and also inaccurate, because kindness was warm, and what Nikolai offered was something colder, more structural, like the steel beams in a building that keep everything standing, but that no one ever sees. "You have been taking care of me," she said finally, "and I need to know why." He was quiet for a long time. The rain filled the silence. His hands were on the table, still, and she watched his jaw work, the muscles flexing beneath the skin, and she understood that she was watching a man fight a war with himself. 4 years ago, he said, October. A Thursday. She waited. I was shot, twice. Once in the chest, once in the abdomen. This was in Gowanus near the canal. A deal that went wrong. The details do not matter. What matters is that I was on the ground, on the sidewalk, at 11 at night in the rain. And I was dying. I knew it. I have been close to death before, and I have never been confused about it. The body knows. The body always knows. He paused. His eyes were on the table, on his hands. A woman found me. She was walking home from work. She was wearing scrubs. She had a bag over her shoulder and she was listening to something on her earphones, and she almost walked past me. She almost did. But she stopped. She knelt down on the wet concrete, and she did not scream, and she did not call the police, and she did not run. She pressed her hands against my chest and told me to stay awake. She said, "You stay with me, you hear me? You do not get to leave." And she stayed with me for 23 minutes until my people arrived. She stopped the bleeding with her hands and a scarf and her own jacket, and when my men came, she stood up and she walked away, and she did not leave her name. Vivian had gone very still. Her hands were in her lap. Her heart was doing something complicated and violent against her ribs. I looked for her, Nikolai said. For 4 years I looked. I had people checking hospital records, security cameras, employment logs for every medical facility within a 10-mile radius of that canal. I had a partial description. Brown hair, a blue bag, scrubs with a hospital ID. But my vision was failing and I could not read the name. I remembered her voice. I remembered her hands. I remembered that she smelled like antiseptic and lavender. And I remembered what she said to me and how she said it, and how there was no hesitation, not 1 second of hesitation. He looked up at her. For the first time since she had known him, his eyes were not steel. They were something raw, something that had been locked behind that frozen surface for years, pressing against the glass. "The night of the auction," he said. "I was not there to bid on anyone. I was there because Alexei insisted it would be good for appearances. I did not intend to participate. I did not intend to do anything at all. And then they put you on that platform, and they laughed, and you stood there, and you took it, and you did not break. And I thought, that is strength, that is real strength. And then you clasped your hands at your waist, the same way, the exact same way she clasped hers when she was pressing my chest. And I looked at you, and I knew." Vivian's eyes were burning. She could not speak. She could feel the tears building behind a dam she had spent her entire life constructing, and the dam was cracking, and she could not stop it. "It was me," she whispered. "I know." "How long have you known?" "Since the moment you stepped onto that platform. You spent 4 years." "Yes." "And you never said no." "Why?" He looked at her, and the answer was in his face, in the raw, unguarded wreckage of it, in the way the mask had finally, completely fallen away. And what was underneath was not the cold machine, or the feared boss, or the man who controlled shipping routes and bought silence with money. What was underneath was a man who had been saved by a stranger and had spent 4 years carrying that debt like a stone in his chest, unable to repay it, unable to forget it, unable to do anything except search. "Because I wanted you to know me first," he said. "Not as the man you saved, as the man I am. And then I wanted you to decide if that man was worth staying for." She was crying. She did not try to stop it. The tears ran down her cheeks and off her jaw, and she let them, because Vivian Calloway had spent 31 years being strong and quiet and invisible. And in this moment, in this vast, empty warehouse with the rain coming down like the world was being washed clean, she did not want to be strong. She wanted to be seen. And he was seeing her. He had been seeing her for 4 years. "October," she said, and her voice broke on the word. I remember October. I remember the rain. I thought about you every day for a month. I went back to that spot 3 times looking for, I don't know what, blood, evidence, something to prove it wasn't a dream. And there was nothing. It was all cleaned up, and I thought you died. I did not die. I can see that. Because of you. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of withholding. It was the silence of 2 people who have been carrying the same weight from opposite ends and have finally set it down in the same place. She reached across the table. Her hand found his fingers closed around hers with a grip that was careful and precise and shaking, and she realized, with a shock that went through her like electricity, that Nikolai Volkov's hands were trembling. You saved my life, he said, and I have spent every day since trying to find a way to deserve it. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Vivian had experienced. The revelation did not dissolve the tension between them. If anything, it deepened it, because now the distance he maintained had a name, and the name was guilt. He had been saved, and he could not forgive himself for needing to be saved. He had been vulnerable, and he had spent 4 years converting that vulnerability into debt, into search, into a mission that had structured his days and given him a purpose beyond the empire he controlled. She understood this because she was a nurse, and she understood trauma the way a mechanic understands engines. Not abstractly, but in the specific, particular way of a person who has seen the inside of something broken and knows how the pieces fit together. She knew that men like Nikolai did not process debt the way other people did. For him, it was not a favor to be repaid. It was a wound that had never healed, a failure in his own mythology of invulnerability. And every meal he sent her, every repaired streetlight, every silent car waiting at the curb was not generosity. It was penance. She told him this. She told him on a Tuesday, standing in his kitchen after he had cooked for her. He could cook, it turned out. Russian dishes mostly, heavy and rich, and made with a competence that suggested years of practice, and she said, "You don't owe me anything." He set the pot down on the counter. "Yes, I do." "No, you don't. I'm a nurse. That's what I do. I found a person who was hurt, and I helped him. I would have done it for anyone. You don't owe me your life for that. You don't owe me dinners and cars and—" She gestured at the warehouse, at the vast, expensive emptiness of it. "And all of this. You would have done it for anyone," he repeated. "Yes. But you did it for me. You say that like it matters. It matters more than anything that has ever mattered to me." She opened her mouth to argue, and he crossed the circle. He did not cross it all at once. He crossed it in one step, and then another, and then he was standing in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his steel eyes, and his hand came up and cupped the side of her face, and the touch was so light, so tentative, so wildly at odds with everything this man was supposed to be, that she felt the breath go out of her in a single, sharp exhale. "You are the only good thing I have ever been given," he said, "and I am terrified of breaking it." She put her hand over his. "Then, don't." He kissed her, not the way she had imagined, not if she was honest she had imagined it, not with force or certainty or the commanding presence that defined every other aspect of his life. He kissed her the way a man who has been starving reaches for bread, carefully, reverently, as if the thing in his hands might crumble if he held it too tightly. She kissed him back, and in the kissing, something that had been circling for weeks found its place, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to be opened. It was Alexei who told her the rest, not intentionally. Alexei was not a man who spilled secrets. He was a man built like a reinforced wall, who had served Nikolai for 19 years and would have walked into a furnace if asked. But one evening, when Nikolai was in a meeting behind closed doors and Vivienne was sitting in the warehouse kitchen reading a medical journal, Alexei sat down across from her with a cup of tea and a face that said he had been thinking about something for a long time. "He's different with you," Alexei said. Vivienne looked up. "Different how?" "He sleeps. He did not sleep for 4 years. Not properly. 3 hours, 4, always with the light on. Now he sleeps. She closed the journal. Alexei. He will not tell you this. He would shoot me for telling you this. But you should know. When he was looking for you, he turned down everything. Every deal that involved hospitals. Every contract that might have disrupted the places you might be working. Every operation that could have led to violence near a medical facility. He redrew the entire map of his operations to protect places you might exist. He did not know your name. He did not know your face. And he rearranged an empire for you. Vivian felt something crack open inside her. Not break. Open. He called you his debt. He, Alexei continued. That is how he speaks of it. But it is not debt. I have known Nikolai Volkov since he was 24 years old. I have seen him afraid twice, once when his mother died, and once that night in the rain, when he told me afterward that a woman had saved his life, and that he could not remember her face but he could remember her voice, and that if he found her, he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never wanted for anything. Alexei took a sip of tea. That is not debt, that is love. He is simply too stubborn to call it by its name. The threat came without warning, the way real threats always do. His name was Viktor Malevich, and he ran a rival operation out of Philadelphia. The details were irrelevant to Vivian, who understood the world Nikolai occupied the way a civilian understands a war zone, in broad strokes, from a safe distance, with the knowledge that the distance could collapse at any moment. What she understood was this: Viktor wanted something Nikolai had, a port access agreement worth $80 million a year, and Viktor had decided that the most efficient path to that agreement was not through Nikolai's defenses, but through the one gap in his armor that had not existed 6 months ago. The gap was Vivian. It began small. A car that followed her to the hospital. A man in a gray coat loitering outside her apartment building 3 days in a row. A phone call from an unknown number that, when she answered, played 10 seconds of silence and then disconnected. She told Nikolai about the car and the man but not the phone call, because she had spent her life solving her own problems, and this felt, irrationally, like something she should handle. Nikolai's response was immediate and total. Within 48 hours, Vivian had a security detail. 2 women, former military, named Kara and Reese, who dressed in civilian clothes and moved with the fluid, unobtrusive competence of people who could disarm someone in 3 seconds and then apologize for the inconvenience. They accompanied her to work, to the grocery store, to the laundromat 2 blocks from her apartment, where she still washed her own clothes, despite Nikolai's increasingly pointed offers to have someone else do it. This is unnecessary, she told him. It is not. Nikolai, I walk through the Bronx at 2 in the morning, and now you walk through the Bronx at 2 in the morning with 2 people who will make sure you arrive home safely. This is not negotiable. She bristled at the word negotiable. It was the first time he had spoken to her with the voice he used with everyone else, the voice of command, the voice that ran shipping routes and silenced rooms, and she did not like it. I'm not one of your operations, she said, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. He looked at her. A long, measured look. Then his jaw softened. Not much, but enough. No, he said. You are not, but you are the only thing I cannot afford to lose. And if that makes me controlling, then I am controlling. And I will apologize for it later, but right now I need you to be safe, please. The please undid her. Not because it was a word she had never heard him use, though it was, but because of the way he said it, the way it came out rough and foreign, like a language he was learning in real time. Okay, she said, but I'm keeping my own apartment. I would not dream of suggesting otherwise. But the threat escalated. 3 weeks after the security detail was assigned, Vivian came home from a shift to find her apartment door unlocked. Not broken into, unlocked, with the precision of someone who had a key, or something better than a key. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged, but on her kitchen counter, placed exactly in the center, was a photograph. It was a photograph of Nikolai, unconscious, on a rain-soaked sidewalk in Gowanus. Taken from above, time-stamped October 14th, 4 years ago. Someone had been watching that night. Someone had watched her save his life, and had photographed it, and had kept the photograph for 4 years, and now they had placed it in her apartment like a chess move, like a message that said, "We know who you are, we know what you mean to him, and we can reach you whenever we want." Vivian did not panic. She had seen gunshot wounds at 3 in the morning, and coded patients and delivered death notifications to families in emergency room hallways. She did not panic, but she sat down on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled to her chest, and she breathed, and she let herself be afraid. Because fear was honest, and honest was what she owed herself. And then she picked up her phone and called Nikolai and told him. His silence when she described the photograph was the most frightening sound she had ever heard. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it did not contain. It did not contain anger or surprise or even menace. It contained calculation. It contained the rapid, silent processing of a man who was reconfiguring the entire board based on a single new piece of information. "Do not move," he said. "I am coming." He arrived in 11 minutes. She knew because she counted every one. He came through the door with Alexei and 2 other men she had not met before, and he went to the photograph on the counter, and he looked at it, and his face did absolutely nothing. And that nothing was the most expressive thing she had ever seen on him, because it was the face of a man containing a rage so complete that allowing any of it to surface would have been catastrophic. He turned to Alexei and said something in Russian. Alexei nodded once and left. Then Nikolai came to where Vivian was sitting on the floor, and he sat down beside her, on the linoleum, in his $7,000 suit, and he took her hand. "This will end," he said. "I will end it." "How?" "In a way that ensures it never happens again. Nikolai, this is not your world. I know. I brought you into it, and that was my choice, and I will live with the consequences of that choice. But I will not live with the consequence of someone harming you. That consequence does not exist. I will erase it before it becomes real." She looked at him, at this man on her kitchen floor, with his controlled fury and his angular handwriting and his 4 years of searching and his hands that trembled when they touched her face. And she made a decision. Not the decision he expected. Not the decision a sensible woman would have made. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I did not ask you to leave, but you're thinking it. You're thinking you should push me away to keep me safe. I can see it. And I'm telling you now, don't. Because I walked away from you once before on that sidewalk, and I have regretted it every day since. I am not walking away again." Something broke in his face, not shattered, broke open, like a frozen river in spring, the ice cracking and the water underneath surging forward, dark and fast and alive. "Vivienne," he said, and her name in his mouth was a sound she would carry for the rest of her life. What happened with Viktor Malevich, she learned later, in pieces, the way one learns about the resolution of a war from the far side of a border. There was a meeting. There were negotiations. There were things that happened in rooms she would never enter, and decisions that were made by men whose names she would never know. Nikolai handled it the way he handled everything, completely, precisely, and without leaving a trace. But there was one detail she learned directly because Alexei told her, because Alexei had decided that Vivian deserved to know the things Nikolai would not say. When Nikolai met Viktor Malevich in a warehouse in Newark, he did not threaten him. He did not raise his voice. He sat down at a metal table and he placed the photograph, the one that had been left in Vivian's kitchen, in front of Viktor, and he said, "You entered the home of the woman who saved my life. You used an image of my worst moment as a weapon against the person who made sure I survived it. I want you to understand what that means. I want you to understand that there is no version of this where you walk away with what you want. There's only the version where you walk away." Viktor Malevich, by all accounts, walked away. His operation in Philadelphia contracted by 60%. Within a month, his access to the eastern ports was revoked. His name, which had once carried weight in certain circles, became a cautionary tale. Not because Nikolai had destroyed him. He hadn't, not technically, but because the world Nikolai controlled had collectively decided that crossing a line that personal, that sacred, was the kind of mistake that restructured hierarchies. The aftermath was quiet. The security detail stayed for 3 more weeks, then reduced to Kara alone, then eventually dissolved entirely when it became clear that the threat had been eliminated with the surgical precision that characterized everything Nikolai did. Vivian moved out of her apartment on a Saturday in March, not into the warehouse, into a 2-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights, 4 blocks away, that she chose herself and paid for with her own salary. Though Nikolai had offered, and she had declined, and he had accepted the decline with a grace that suggested he understood that her independence was not a rejection of him, but a condition of her. She kept working at Lenox Hill. She kept her shifts. She kept her routine, her cereal, her 4 a.m. walks to the subway, though now the walks included Nikolai's driver idling at the curb, which she allowed because she had learned that love, real love, not the kind in movies or books, but the kind that exists between 2 complicated people in a complicated world, requires negotiation and compromise and the willingness to let someone else carry part of the weight. The gala came around again the following November. The Bellworth Children's Foundation annual benefit, same estate, same chandeliers, same champagne, same 300 people, dressed in the careful armor of the very rich. Vivian did not volunteer for the auction. She attended as a guest, on the arm of Nikolai Volkov, wearing a dress she had chosen herself, a deep burgundy, cut to her body, not borrowed, not hiding, not performing, just her. They entered together. The room noticed. The room always noticed when Nikolai Volkov entered a space. But tonight the room noticed something else, something it did not know how to categorize. The way his hand rested at the small of her back, possessive and gentle in equal measure. The way she walked beside him without hesitation, without deference, without making herself smaller. The way they moved through the crowd like 2 bodies in orbit, connected by a gravity that had nothing to do with money or power or appearance and everything to do with a rain-soaked sidewalk 4 years ago, and a woman who had knelt in the dark and told a stranger he was not allowed to die. Preston Hale was at the bar. He saw them. His face went through a sequence of expressions that Vivian catalogued with clinical precision. Recognition, confusion, discomfort, and finally, a flicker of something that might have been shame, though she doubted it, because men like Preston Hale did not feel shame. They felt inconvenience. He approached. She felt Nikolai's hand stiffen at her back. "Vivienne," Preston said with the jovial bluster of a man who believes that confidence can overwrite history. "Good to see you. You look wonderful." "Thank you," she said. Nothing more. She did not owe him more. "Listen, about last year, I hope there are no hard feelings. Just a joke. You know how these things—" "I do know," she said. "And you should know that the boy you see standing next to me spent $100,000 that night because he saw something in me that you couldn't. And the reason you couldn't isn't because it wasn't there. It's because you weren't looking." Preston Hale's mouth opened. Then it closed. Then it opened again. No sound came out. He looked at Nikolai, who was watching him with the flat, patient expression of a cat watching a bird that has wandered too close to the window, and whatever Preston Hale saw in those steel-gray eyes convinced him that the conversation was over. He walked away. He did not come back. Nikolai leaned down. His mouth was near her ear. "You did not need me for that," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." They danced once, a slow waltz that neither of them was particularly good at, which made it better because it was real. They swayed more than they danced in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 300 people who were watching them with the fascinated incomprehension of a crowd witnessing something it cannot explain, and will not forget. The plus-size nurse from Queens and the most feared man on the Eastern Seaboard, turning slowly beneath the chandeliers, his hand on her waist, her head against his shoulder, neither of them speaking, because they had already said everything that mattered months ago, on a kitchen floor in Astoria, and the silence between them now was not absence. It was fullness. It was the silence of two people who have found each other against odds so absurd they would be laughable if they were not, instead, miraculous. After the dance, they stood by the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds, where the rain had stopped and the November sky had cleared to reveal a field of stars so bright they looked defiant. "I have something for you," Nikolai said. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small object. Not a box, not jewelry. A scarf, folded into a neat square, its fabric soft and worn, and unmistakably the same color as the one she had pressed against his chest 4 years ago on that sidewalk. "You kept it," she said. "I kept everything." She unfolded it. The fabric was stained, faintly, in places that no amount of cleaning could erase. She held it in both hands and looked at it and felt the full, extraordinary weight of what it represented. A moment of instinct, a moment of choice, a moment when a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much had decided that she was exactly enough, and had pressed her hands against a stranger's chest and refused to let the world take him. "I used to be the woman no one wanted," she said softly. "I used to stand in rooms like this and wait for someone to see me. And now?" She looked up at him. At this man who had searched for her for 4 years and sent her meals and fixed her radiator and sat on her kitchen floor and kissed her like bread and told her she was the only good thing he had ever been given. At this man who had been dying in the rain and had heard her voice and had decided in that moment that the voice was the thing worth living for. "Now I know that I was never invisible," she said. "I was just waiting to be found by someone who knew how to look." Nikolai Volkov, who had not smiled in public in 4 years, who controlled an empire with silence and steel, who was feared by men who feared nothing else, looked at Vivian Calloway and smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the flicker at the corner of his mouth. A real smile, full and unguarded and raw, the kind of smile that rewrites everything you thought you knew about a face. And in the ballroom of the Belworth estate, beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people who would never fully understand what they were witnessing, Vivian smiled back, and the space between them, the careful, calculated distance that had defined them from the beginning, finally, completely closed. Boom. She pressed the scarf into his hand. He looked at it, then at her. "You don't need to carry this anymore," she said. He folded his fingers around the fabric and around her hand beneath it, and held on, and the holding was everything, and the November stars burned above them like promises that someone, somewhere, intended to keep. If this story satisfied something deep inside you, if you felt the satisfaction of watching every person who laughed get proven wrong, then you already belong here. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications, because the next story hits even harder, and you don't want to miss what's coming.